So I'm Olivia Wickline. As previously mentioned, I'm from the Experience Children's Museum. And I just first want to take, on behalf of the 2022 JCLA cohort, and thank you all for joining us today and being inquisitive participants as we share what has culminated from this past 7 months, give or take, of work, research, and collaboration. In this next hour and a half, we are excited to share the highlights of our 50-page publication detailing the prompt, Bridging the Urban-Rural Divide, Infrastructure, Resources, and Services. I will be walking us through and giving context to our methodology, along with definitions that will help us guide through our main touch points. Jenny Tompkins will then share findings on infrastructure through broadband, housing, recreation. Following her, Donnie Hathaway will detail the bulk of the research. Clark Tiemann will share our findings on services through education, economy, and workforce, and public transportation. And then to wrap it up, Raven Clark will share our reoccurring themes and highlights, and Autumn Parker will share our conclusion and next steps. So with that being said, let's get into it, shall we? So, as you may have guessed, and Angela touched on, the concept of bridging the urban-rural divide was one that took several conversations among our cohort. So I want to give you a little bit of context as to where we finally got to. We began our research through the design thinking framework. This was a human-first, empathetic way of framing what was to come. Through this, we did qualitative interviewing. We sat down at Radius Co-work and talked through what were main points of living in Erie County. From there, we then decided to break down our information through the counties that we personally would explore firsthand in our JCLA cohort. These included, bear with me on this list, the city of Erie, Corry, Union City, Northeast Borough, Harbor Creek Township, Mill Creek, Edinburgh, Albion, and Fairview. Now, more of those counties were touched upon in our main research. However, that is where we started. So as we began to collaborate and get information on these municipalities, that is when we could finally really dig into what made up infrastructure, resources, and services. What was quantitative data that we could use when looking at these municipalities? We found that these included broadband, housing, recreation, energy and utilities, healthcare and emergency services, education, economy and workforce, and public transportation, of which we will delve into later on in this presentation. But before we get into that, we first needed to define what we were even looking at. Again, this was no easy feat, as all three of these, infrastructure, resources, and services, are often used interchangeably. As we work through these definitions, I'm going to use public transportation as an example to kind of show you what these mean. So to start out with infrastructure, we based these existing definitions on we use existing definitions, and so we use infrastructure as a devised delivery mechanism for resources and services. So for example, in public transportation, the physical buses of EMTA are a portion of their core infrastructure. Resources then were defined as inherent or natural sources of supply, support, or aid. The workforce remains a vital resource for EMTA. Thus, the number of employees with CDL certification determines those able to serve as drivers. And lastly, services are defined as goods or amenities delivered. So for example, EMTA provides services for people to get from point A to point B, as in a line running between Erie and Corry. Now, in order to define urban and rural, we had to get a consensus and get a bit creative in our definition. So in order to find the 9 municipalities that we visited as urban and rural, we used the U.S. Census Bureau, based on its widespread influence as the foundation. Now, the Census Bureau divides urban into 2 categories, based on population density and total. The most populous areas of the US are considered metropolitan or urbanized, while the second level is defined as micropolitan or urban cluster. Rural is simply defined as all areas not considered urban. That doesn't necessarily work for our research. Instead, we found that we considered all municipalities that contained metropolitan areas would be urban, and all municipalities that contained micropolitan would be rural. You can see in this map that areas in orange, which were considered urbanized areas, we used as urban. And the areas in purple would originally be considered metropolitan areas, we used as rural. So as a result, the city of Erie and Fairview, Harbor Creek, and Mill Creek townships were deemed urban, while city of Corry and Albion, Edinburgh, Northeast, and Union City boroughs became rural. So, with that context and those definitions in mind, Jenny Tompkins will now delve into transportation.
Thanks, Olivia, for leading us off there, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Again, my name is Jenny Tompkins. I work for Penn Future, a statewide environmental advocacy organization, and I'm our Erie campaign manager for clean water advocacy. So Olivia mentioned a lot about the way we set up the scope of work for our project and the definitions. We needed to assess if a rural-urban divide exists in Erie County regarding infrastructure, resources, services, and then needed to evaluate the individual systems that we outlined. So we chose to highlight actually a key challenge in either infrastructure, resources, or services within each of those categories. Just given capacity, we couldn't do it all across 8 categories. So I'm going to discuss the infrastructure portion of the paper. And just as a reminder, infrastructure is defined as a devised delivery mechanism for resources and services. I'm going to start with broadband. This is a known area of infrastructure barriers. I want to just quickly set the stage for what the definition of broadband is. The U.S. Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, defines broadband as based on upload and download speeds. Broadband is a minimum of 25 megabytes per second download and 3 megabytes per second upload speed. So overall, we found that there's a stark difference in infrastructure development and capacity between Erie County's urban and rural communities as we define them, particularly north and south of Interstate 90. In fact, the Erie County Broadband Initiative estimated that 99% of areas north of the highway have access to broadband speeds versus only about 25% of those south of it. However, misleading reporting historically from service providers to the FCC has led to access barriers across the county, in fact, the entire country, illuminating the importance of community involvement in data reporting, and that just because we have access to infrastructure doesn't mean we've considered things like affordability. As a result, both our urban and rural communities would benefit from infrastructure investment, which I'll show with a couple of maps later on. Our research showcased that closing the broadband access gap across Erie County will require the commitment of levels of government from municipal, county, state, and federal. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, led us to understand the vast differences in access to broadband, as we had schools and employers struggling to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, particularly in 2020. So with the passage of the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the creation of a Pennsylvania Broadband Development Authority, plenty of other actions over the last couple of years, just showcases that every level of government is going to have commitment and investment to solve broadband access barriers. The story of broadband access and recent efforts also address, again, the importance of community involvement. I just wanted to emphasize again that without household-level reporting, we would have never understood and been able to pinpoint geographically where additional investment is needed, including in Erie County. We also know that we need to have multi-sector collaboration. I mentioned that schools, institutions, businesses, and even individual households can play a role in key discussions about broadband development and expansion. And each of us will explain a project that's going on within Erie County now that's effective at bridging urban, rural, and other divides. So I wanted to just mention the Erie Area Council of Governments and Erie County Planning are working together on an Erie County broadband initiative and a study that will really focus on where investments are needed here in Erie County. We, of course, encourage the 9 municipalities that we studied to engage in that process, but also all 38 municipalities in Erie County. And I wanted to mention that that doesn't always come easy. We, of course, have a lot of us in the media seen more recent FCC maps actually included all of Erie County as having broadband access technically, and it opened up a process where the public and institutions had the ability to challenge those maps because they will directly impact the allocation of resources given to Pennsylvania that ultimately trickles down to local communities. So we all have a role to play in this. So I just want to end with some of those maps that I mentioned because this is a topic where it's really helpful to see spatially what's going on. This first map shows green areas based on prior FCC data, not the most recent publication I was talking about that had all of Erie County covered, which we could dig into for a whole hour alone. But the green areas here are what were estimated to have broadband speed coverage in 2018. We see that most of the communities that we studied are those that had access. However, when you start to look at a household level reporting situation, you start to see that in blue, those are households who report speeds, whereas in red, those are areas where there are not sufficient speeds to be designated as broadband. Corey is a really good example. In the city of Corey, we showed that most of the city should have had access in green, but Corey's own comprehensive plan shows that the average broadband speed in the community is well below, or not, the average internet speed is well below broadband level. So we can see here that this is more complicated than initially assumed. So in summary, access barriers for broadband, very much an infrastructure problem, with large areas of our county having no reliable internet coverage or slow speeds. We see that there's a large divide, particularly by urban and rural communities, especially when you consider proximity to Interstate 90. However, all communities can benefit from additional coverage, better affordability, expansion of services for last mile connections, which are those really hard places to reach. And we know that these issues transcend political municipal boundaries. School districts, for example, need to benefit uniformly, but they may be multi-municipal districts. So good thing to keep in mind there. Also going to talk about infrastructure issues associated with housing. There are drastic differences in access to home ownership, housing values between suburban and urban core, in this case, City of Erie, and the rural communities that we studied. Likely not to the surprise of anyone in this room. In other words, Fairview, Harbor Creek, Mill Creek townships are home to higher median incomes and newer and higher valued housing stock. I'm going to use the phrase that others don't love to use. Urban sprawl, of course, is a conversation tied to housing. We know that communities that had urban sprawl contributed to a lack of investment in our community cores, in the boroughs and cities that we studied in Erie County, that now face older housing stock tied to blight, greater exposure to toxins like lead, mold, etc., and the need to right-size based on shifting population demographics. In many of the communities that face housing challenges, they have declining populations and aging populations, for example. So urban sprawl increases the number of vehicle miles traveled and associated greenhouse gas emissions. I'm putting on my environmental advocacy hat only very briefly, I swear, and other challenges associated with strip malls and traffic and congestion and all the things that we can think of in those situations. So we know that the pandemic also had a great impact on housing. In Erie County, we saw housing prices rise by almost 70% between 2018 and 2022. That can be even higher when you look at place-specific or municipal-specific data. So this may impact the way that people view Erie and its relative affordability, especially if we don't invest in the infrastructure issues we have, because you're not even getting the value for your money when you do invest and become a homeowner. And I do want to highlight that there are programs in this area that are working well. I won't go into too much detail, but one that we mentioned is a tie to social services in our paper. The Mercy Center for Women, that provides vital transitional housing for women and families facing trauma, expanded as well, just before and during the pandemic. Their new community center, which was formerly a Catholic school, is now infrastructure for people who were facing homelessness or needed transitional housing, which was a barrier in the city of Erie in particular, where there are housing issues that I've mentioned. So I thought the best way, I just included Google Maps imagery here to show the differences between City of Erie and Mill Creek, which border each other in a relative proximity, but an East Erie neighborhood and the housing development style that happened there is much different from the housing subdivision that you see in West Mill Creek. So, with that in mind, housing, of course, is a complex issue, and we would benefit from working across municipalities, but we would recommend that maybe the boroughs that we studied and the cities that we studied come to terms with the relative parallels and the challenges that they face and think of ways to work together to address some of those issues. Lastly, recreation can be a discussion about infrastructure and barriers. Urban and rural communities alike that we studied prioritize public space improvements, often in their comprehensive planning. I'm going to bring up the pandemic again. Of course, we know that COVID-19 brought to the surface how important it was to be able to recreate in public space and have green space available. And we know that all of the communities that we studied have a plethora of parks and green spaces that they operate. Leaders now recognize that quality of life, mental health, and physical health improvements come from spending time outside. Presque Isle State Park, for example, already the most visited state park in Pennsylvania, had record high attendance during the pandemic. But that huge surge in reliance on outdoor spaces and recreational amenities led to a lot of pressure that even increased the need for investment in infrastructure improvements. So I'm actually going to cheat for just a second and not talk only about infrastructure when it comes to recreation, because we had some really important discussions during our time in JCLA. Many of the communities profiled considered the importance of programming recreational space. So how can you have activities and enrichment to build community rather than just offering physical infrastructure? Many communities want to expand trails, build playgrounds, enhance sports fields. But how important is it to lead a birdwatching walk on that trail, or provide childcare programs when a playground is present, or create youth sports leagues when we improve fields? Those are what make community spaces and recreational amenities vibrant and a sense of tight-knit community. The Northeast Recreation Commission, Impact Quarry, and the Erie Downtown Partnership are just some of the examples that came up in our research of the importance of collaborative programming in these spaces. However, we were then left wondering, how do smaller communities with fewer resources benefit from similar infrastructure and resource investments? How can we address barriers to access for residents that haven't had the opportunity or ability to access those resources and infrastructure over the pandemic? And before, of course. Recreation is another area where multi-municipal collaboration, urban and rural included, is so important. Some communities have more resources, as I mentioned, and can execute grant applications, have staff, and maintain infrastructure. So I'm going to bring up what's working well, or what will be working well, that we encourage communities to participate in. That is, that Erie County Planning plans to hire a Parks and Recreation coordinator to work across municipalities to implement a lot of what has been outlined in their comprehensive plans. They did their own collaborative Parks, Trails, and Recreation plan to assess where there would be opportunities for collaboration. Of course, we recommend that the communities we studied, and all of them, engage in this and can work across municipalities for change. And I'm just going to give two maps really quickly. The PA Department of Conservation and Natural Resources has made access a key part of their strategic planning across the Commonwealth. And we can see here that when we're talking about 10-minute walkability to recreational amenities, it's the 9 communities that we studied, of course, where you have these tight-knit community centers where people are struggling to be able to have walkability. So we encourage data like this and this, which is 10-minute drive accessibility to trails, where we see that the city of Erie, where we know a large percentage of people don't have the ability and privilege to own a vehicle to access Presque Isle, is a type of data that can be used in joint grant applications to show what this need is. So with that in mind, overall, I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic created new or exacerbated old challenges associated with broadband, housing, and recreational infrastructure. The barriers to access differ across these categories, though, but overarchingly, we know that opportunities already exist for urban and rural communities to work together. We encourage those 9 communities that we studied, and the other ones found in Erie County, to take advantage of these existing opportunities, but also to consider additional opportunities for cooperation. We know there's a lot of state and federal money that came as a result of the pandemic and other barriers that can be utilized to make improvements. We have a lot of once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. So with that being said, thank you for your time and attention. Donnie Hathaway will now provide an overview of the resources portion of our research.
Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I just want to give another round of applause to Jenny for giving an amazing overview of infrastructure, and to Olivia for kicking off this presentation. And we'll hold on to the applause just one moment. Not just those two, but the other presenters that will be coming after me, as well as our fellow cohort members. So let's give a round of applause to JCLA 2022. Next, I would again like to thank those of you in the audience, those who might be watching online or will be watching online, and just to being invested in the Erie community and seeing what amazing work these change agents, being the JCLA cohort, did during our 8 months experience. So again, I'm Donnie Hathaway. I'm the Marketing and Communications Coordinator at United Way for Erie County. I'm also a captain in the Air Force Reserves out of Youngstown Air Reserve Station. So Olivia did a great job, again, kicking us off and providing these definitions that our cohort found. Again, because there's so much information, we wanted to hone in on our scope. So resources are inherent or natural sources of supply, support, or aid. Supply, support, or aid. Can everyone in the room please say that? Supply, support, or aid. I have an instructor background too. So with that being said, we're going to break down resources under the umbrella of bridging the urban-rural divide in Erie County into two main subcategories: energy and utilities, and healthcare and emergency services. So we'll start with energy and utilities. But before I even get into the information, I want to paint a picture for you all. In energy and utilities, we're going to be talking about water and heating and electricity. So who here in the room, and you don't have to raise your hand this time, has endured an Erie winter? You can raise your hand if you want to. Maybe it was the flash freeze, this crazy flash freeze that we had back in December with sub-zero temperatures. I don't know if you went outside. I did, and I quickly regretted it. Or maybe you were here in 2017 when we had record-breaking blizzards. Right? We can understand by those two examples alone that heating is important. So that's why I'm going to dive into that here shortly. Or what about, again, living in Erie, just north of us, go down State Street, and what do you hit? Water, Lake Erie. That's a huge asset to have here in our Erie County, in our community. So these are very important discussions and invaluable resources that provide supply, support, and aid to our community. So let's dive into energy and utilities. We're going to start with some drinking water. I found a recent study out of the U.S. Sciences Journal that recommended each person should have at least 15.5 cups of water a day. Now, I'm not here to judge if you had 15.5 cups of water a day, but I hope you've been drinking some water in order to survive. It's important. This is a resource, an invaluable resource to our residents. We need it to survive. So what our cohort found is that all of these 9 municipalities that we studied have some level of access to drinking water. Again, we're grateful for having the lake right just north of us. The largest water system being Erie Waterworks. Erie Waterworks supports the city of Erie. It also trickles out into surrounding boroughs and townships. And for those municipalities of focus that aren't supported by Erie Waterworks, they have their own water systems. Again, water is an invaluable resource. But with that invaluable resource does come challenges. As you heard from Jenny, we're going to be providing some challenges that face our community, but also opportunity or things that are happening that are benefiting the community. So some challenges that face drinking water in our Erie community is aging infrastructure. Manpower, the people to maintain these water systems, getting from point A to point B, from the headquarters to the people. Overall capacity. So again, these are challenges. What are some ways, or what's an example that the community has combated this? In our research, we found that through a grant-led line project a few years ago, the city of Erie received $15 million in funds to be able to improve some of that aging infrastructure and hopefully to continue to build capacity. Again, this is an invaluable resource. So I spent a little bit of time talking about drinking water. Now we're going to talk about sewer wastewater, hopefully not the drinking kind. So again, an important resource, right? We need to properly dispose of human waste. So starting in the city core, we have the main water treatment facility right off of the bayfront. I drive past it every day going to United Way, to my workplace. It supports approximately 200,000 residents throughout Erie County. For those communities that it doesn't support, they might use septic systems or small flow treatment facilities, SFTFs. And again, it's important to properly dispose of waste. So the Erie County Health Department has found made it a priority to regularly check these SFTFs to ensure proper disposal of waste. So again, talked about drinking water, talked a little bit about sewer wastewater. Now we're going to talk about heating and electricity. Again, very important. We have really cold temperatures here in the Erie community. So some background knowledge, most of you probably already know this. They're probably your providers, but we have Penelec and National Fuel as our main gas and electricity providers. We've also seen not only in Erie County, but across the nation, an increase in prices, upwards of 18 cents per kilowatt per hour this past season. That's staggering. Do you want to hear another staggering statistic? In our research, the cohort found that those at or below the poverty line spend approximately 12 to 24% of their income on heating and electricity. 12 to 24%. I see some head nods. That's almost a quarter of someone's income. And so when you're talking about breaking barriers, when you're talking about ending generational cyclical poverty, spending a quarter of your income on heating and electricity is very staggering. This is a challenge in and of itself. So we encourage you in the audience, and your organizations, leaders, to look out for subsidies and monies to combat these issues, to use resources that are out there. I'm going to put on my United Way hat real quick and use the 211 helpline. It's a resource provided for all members to dial 211. You can call 211 and you'll be connected with a resource navigator that will help connect those in need to maybe help pay a utility bill. So again, there are challenges that the community is facing as it pertains to energy and utilities, but there are good things that are happening. Next, another invaluable resource. Again, those inherent or natural supply sources that supply support aid our community are healthcare and emergency services. Now, before I get too far into this section, I just wanted to thank those in the room, again, maybe those who are watching, that are healthcare providers, or maybe emergency service technicians, frontline servicemen and women. Just wanted to thank you for everything that you do. All right, so earlier today, I was sitting in my office and I heard a bunch of sirens going down the street. We hear the sirens, we see the lights. Again, an invaluable resource. People get sick. Emergencies, crises happen. So we need the people to support this. We need the healthcare professionals, the police, the fire departments, the EMS technicians and service providers. If you follow the news, more specifically, I'll use the last 2 weeks, for example, out of the Erie News Now, you've seen maybe both positive, maybe negative or challenging news reports when it comes to this realm of healthcare and emergency services. One example last week was a report that came out that $90,000 of grant monies was funneled back into 6 fire stations in Erie County. That's positive. When you're talking about what our cohort found, one of the major crises when it comes to healthcare and emergency services is manpower, maybe aging equipment. This money can really help these fire stations out. But again, something our cohort found in our research and through our discussions with local leaders and officials over the past 8 months is that there are dwindling volunteer forces. There's an overall manpower crisis. And again, there was just a report on this a few days ago through Erie News Now. So I'm going to break down healthcare and emergency services real quick, and then we'll get to Clark. I know he's sitting there eagerly. So just some background when it comes to healthcare. We have major institutions in the urban core. Again, it trickles out into the surrounding municipalities and communities. We have UPMC Hammett. We have Allegheny Health Network, St. Vincent, and LECOM, Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine. And when Jenny, you had the image on the screen about the West Mill Creek, it's like, that's where I live, right across from LECOM, the school. So these are major institutions that we have right in our backyard. And they do trickle out different networks, such as the Corey Memorial Hospital is part of the LECOM network. It does trickle out into the rest of the community. And maybe some of our municipalities and focus don't have major hospitals, but they do have medical clinics and offices. With those institutions, those hospitals, those offices, we also need ambulatory and EMS services. And one thing that was encouraging, just the other day, again, sort of United Way, sort of social media hat, I was able to talk with a representative after a social media conversation from EmergiCare. And she was talking about the opportunity to bring students from a local elementary school to EmergiCare offices to show them an ambulance vehicle, to meet maybe EMS technicians and providers, to have that overall exposure. And then later in the spring, bringing that to the school. That's a form of potential recruitment. That's definitely a step in the right direction, especially when we're talking about manpower crises and, manpower crisis. Maybe they'll be the next fireman or woman or EMS provider or healthcare professional. Speaking of fire and police, again, there's a lot of information. I'm not going to go provide a lot of statistics or data because there's so much information. But Erie Fire and Police cover approximately 20 miles. They do have 8 fire stations and over 180 police officers. Surrounding municipalities, such as Corey, Mill Creek, Northeast, to name a few, also have police force. Maybe some municipalities that we focus on, those 9, don't have a police force, for example, in their backyard. They might rely upon state police or that volunteer force that I've been foot stomping for the past 10 minutes. So overall, when it comes to healthcare and emergency services, there are challenges. The manpower crisis, aging equipment. But with that, and I've shared a few successes, I'll share one more. In our research, we found that in 2012, Corey aligned with this CREMA, is the acronym, see if I get it right, Conaway Regional Emergency Management Agency. That's right. Is that right, Chelsea? Which bottom line is, when there's a man-made or natural disaster, those that are within CREMA areas hold together their resources and supplies, as well as work with agencies, nonprofits, and organizations to attack this emergency head-on. And this combats maybe their lacking resources. This adoption of CREMA combats that. So when you want to talk about challenges like I have, this is one thing that's done well that we encourage maybe other municipalities can use as a framework moving forward. And I believe Raven and Autumn will talk about this later. So overall, thank you for hanging in there. We talked about all things resources. Under that umbrella, talked about energy and utilities. We know that we have a lot of water. It's important to drink water. We need to get rid of human waste. We need to keep warm during the warm months, especially. And we've also seen and know and understand that people get sick. We need to have proper healthcare professionals. We need to have the facilities to do so. We need to have the services, the ambulatory services, and those to protect and serve our community and get it done properly. So thank you all for your time and attentiveness. Love seeing some of the nonverbals, the head nods, and your participation in some of my questions. So now I'm going to hand it over to Clark to talk all things services. Have a wonderful day.
Hi, folks. You can probably gather that it's been a pleasure to work with our entire cohort, but especially Donnie. He's our resident cheerleader. So while he made sure that you all recognized us, I want to make sure that we're recognizing Donnie for all of his hard work. So thank you, Donnie. As he said, I am Clark Tiemann. I am the Assistant Director of Student Leadership and Involvement at Penn State Behrend. I am not from Erie, so my entire purpose of joining the cohort and something that was realized for me was really understanding my new home and coming together with a great group of professionals from all walks of life and different disciplines has really helped me to understand the place that I live. So I'm very grateful. This research was a huge highlight for me. To put my researcher hat back on, I also want to recognize that all of the people who have spoken and everyone who contributed to the work that we've published, none of us are experts in the things that we wrote about. So I think that it really goes to show the effort and work and diligence that we all put towards the work. As you can tell, it's a big chunk of things to investigate and to come forth with recommendations. So yes, so thank you very much for your patience. I, again, am here to talk about our services, which, as we defined, are goods and amenities delivered. So starting with education. As you might have guessed, a lot of the data that we had to sort through, we didn't end up using because we wanted to make sure that we could provide comparative analyses between our different municipalities, both urban and rural, to make meaning of the things that we're seeing. So lots of numbers exist based on US Census data, various projects that have been led through state, federal, and local initiatives and nonprofits and governmental bodies. So education particularly, we have a lot of children in Erie County, and so there's a lot of data about the various educational facilities that they find themselves. So a huge project was figuring out how do we make any sense of all of this information between public and private, between our charter magnet and traditional schooling systems, pre-K, elementary, middle, high school, and higher education, of which we have a plethora of options. And then again, how do we whittle all of that down to make meaning? So what data was worth analysis for our overall topic, bridging the urban and rural divide? What data was convenient for us when we were writing this is also huge. So we decided to focus more so on our high schools in the county, particularly our public schools. And that's just because it's really, really easy once we see tables that are presented in the final work, the differences between them. Presumably, they should have a lot in common. They're typically grades 9 through 12. A lot of them have similar student body numbers. A lot of them have similar student-to-teacher ratios, but the funding that is available for them, the graduation rates, the testing scores, and the job placement and college placement scores are all very different. It's probably not a surprise to you that when looking at McDowell, Erie High, and Union City, for example, so a micropolitan area, a metropolitan area, and then an urban cluster that is south of I-90, McDowell and Union City have far less in common than, McDowell and Erie High have far less in common than Erie High and Union City do when it comes to the statistics that I mentioned earlier. So graduation rate. McDowell has a much higher graduation rate than either of those two secondary education institutions. When it comes to teacher ratios, McDowell has a much higher teacher ratio than Erie High. Job placement, college placement, all of those statistics are more favorable in our suburban areas. So we're talking about bridging urban and rural divide. Our urban education system and our rural education system actually have far much more in common than, for example, Fairview, Northeast, Harbor Creek, with some exceptions, and McDowell. I don't think that that's probably very surprising to you, right? And that is directly associated with tax brackets, with regional GDPs, with contributions from various local businesses. And we will see that it all ties back to who's living in the area throughout each of these various services. There is also a huge gap, as to be expected, between our public and private and selective institutions. And that, again, speaks to the link of income. Our private institutions have support from families who are able to send their students to those schools. We did, however, disinclude many of our private institutions, mostly because we don't know where those students are coming from. So just because Mercyhurst, for example, is in South Erie City, they might have students that are coming from Cohort, Union City, Albion, etc. Whereas with our public schools, it's much easier to find out where those students are coming from and what that speaks to for their general environment. We love to talk about our successes, and a huge success when it comes to education is the community school model. Again, very similarly to CREMA, what Donnie was mentioning with our EMS and fire services, it's all about collaboration. So that might mean inter-community collaboration, but in particular with United Way Community School, it's about communicating between the professionals, so our teachers, staff, and administrators, with the general community that surrounds them. So that might mean families, that might mean businesses, that might mean nonprofits, and the ways that we are able to address gaps in education that are created because of these issues with resources, funding, tax brackets, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you to our folks with the United Way. I also do want to mention really quickly, Title I is also a collaborative step, and that comes from our state legislature. So again, all hands on deck when it comes to educating our children in the county. Communities that might not have the means to do so on their own, especially when compared to some of our private or more prestigious institutions, our magnet schools. It takes everything, and sometimes that means a helping hand from our state. I wish that we had more. So that's something to leave as we're moving forward onto our economy and workforce. So first and foremost, a huge thank you and a recognition of a lot of the work that's been done before. There is so much to say about economy when it comes to Erie, PA. We definitely wanted to focus on bridging the urban and rural divides, and so those 8 or 9 municipalities that we discussed throughout the paper. If you would like to know more, especially to see more recommendations for what can be done, there's a lot of recommendations within our paper. Some of those are the Erie Playbook. Various other municipalities have their own growth projects. Our own colleagues, the previous JCLA cohorts, have done things around the blue economy. So that's economy around water, which, as Donnie said, there's plenty of around here. As well as the future of work by the JCLA 2022 cohort. Huge recommendation of checking those out if you would like to know more. I'm saying a lot of things that probably don't surprise you, but they bear repeating. It's probably known that there is seen a slow shift in countywide manufacturing over the last several years, and that continues. Manufacturing used to be the highest industry of employment, as well as the highest contributor to the local real GDP. And that has moved towards centralized insurance as well as healthcare systems. As Donnie mentioned, while there are various health networks within the Erie County communities, many of them are rooted in centralized networks. So Allegheny, University of Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. Even St. Vincent, who has doctors throughout the county, is localized within Erie City and the general area. So that continues to show in, oh, I apologize. Let's go back to education for a second. All right, so you can see here that not only are we talking about funding when it comes to resources, we're also talking about attainment. So if you're looking, again, if we're talking gaps in between our urban and rural communities, you can actually, again, see that higher educational attainment is seen in our suburban areas. That's those areas north of I-90, with the exception of Erie City. Erie City's educational attainment rates are actually much more in common with areas like Edinburgh, with educational attainment in Union City, with Albion. Again, our urban areas and our rural areas have much more similar statistics, and it is our suburban areas that are our outliers. All right, apologize. Back to economy. You with me? Yes. Okay, thank you. So talking about the slippage of our manufacturing, it's still big. I'm not here to say that we're in a post-industrial society. We certainly still have manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing is still a huge piece of the local GDP. However, you can see that it is no longer the first place in contribution to GDP that has fallen to finance, insurance, and real estate. And if you're thinking, well, Clark, isn't that a nationwide trend? Aren't we sending a lot of our manufacturing overseas? Yeah, we are. The US has in fact seen a 0.1 decrease between 2001 and 2021. Not as bad as one would expect the way the news reads. PA has been hit a little bit harder, but let's take a look at Erie. The gap between 2001 and 2021 in the manufacturing share of our local GDP. The impact is much starker in Erie communities than it is in the state, and especially across the nation. So when we're talking about this continual slippage from manufacturing, that hits Erie a little bit harder than it does everyone else. And so what does that mean for our municipalities? If we're looking at the percentage of folks who work in manufacturing who reside in certain municipalities, it does hit certain municipalities harder. And the more we see that slippage of employment as well as contribution to GDP, that is going to target specific communities. And you can see here that Corey City and Union City, for example, have a whopping 31% and 37% respectively of their citizenry employed in manufacturing. Whereas they only have 8.45% and 3.04% of their citizenry employed in finance and insurance, respectively, as well as 12% and 9% roughly in healthcare and social assistance. Those are contrasted by folks who live in Mill Creek, Fairview, Harbor Creek. Erie City, it's not quite fitting this narrative I've been spinning for the past few slides of, well, there's this huge gap between the suburban areas and Erie City. I want to point out that if you were to run this with particular zip codes, Erie City would look much, much, much different, particularly those 01, 02, 03 zip codes. All right, and we did do that report, and the numbers are much more similar to those in Union City and Corey as compared to our suburban areas. Make sense? So if we continue to see slippage of manufacturing, I think we can see what communities will be hardest hit by that loss of jobs and income. So moving on to my final service that I'm chatting about, public transportation. this is one of the few services that I think is truly a geographic divide. I've done a lot of work to try to explain to you that Erie City has a lot more in common with our rural areas when it comes to lack of services and access than it does with our suburban areas. But I would say the public transportation falls more along urban and rural delineation. You can see this map here. As long as you're following the shoreline, you have relative access to public transportation. The urban core does have much more, but I challenge you to think of where EMTA is headquartered, so that does make absolutely more sense. And then when you go out to Albion, when you go to Union City, when you're going to Corey, when you're going even further south, the access is really limited. Some of those communities are only seeing one bus a day, and that's during the work day, and it's in the morning, and then they're not able to return until the night. And then services for most communities south of I-90 actually stop at 5:30. So that's not really productive for folks who live outward and have to travel into the city or to our shoreline communities for work, because that does leave them without access to getting back home. It's not just a dearth of services. I would argue that a lack of education is a huge problem that EMT does recognize that they have. People don't know how to ride the bus in Erie. Even people with plenty of access. They don't know why they should ride the bus. They don't know what the bus can get them to or what it does. There's a lack of awareness, and there's a lack of infrastructure. So Corey actually reports that people don't ride the bus because it gets rainy and snowy in Corey, and none of their shelters are covered, or none of their stops are sheltered, I should say. So why would they wait for one bus in the rain, in the cold, when they could take a car? Unfortunately, that puts people who do not have cars out of luck for a lot of their transportation needs. Going back to healthcare, going back to education, a lot of these places are centralized. And so if you don't have a way to get to those central locations, that means relying on friends. We did look into some of our car ride services. Service becomes really spotty for Uber when you're getting out into the more southern communities. Our one taxi fare service actually is no longer running in the county. So we're really seeing a huge lack of access for our folks that are south of I-90 if it means they do not have a car with public transportation. And as someone who's lived in a metropolitan area, I can speak to the blessings of having successful public transportation on the environment, on ease of travel, on law and policy violations, drunk driving, all of those sorts of things. So there's a lot to be said about the fact that we just don't have people riding the bus, really, even in areas where they do have access. So I'm going to wrap up my services and send it over to Raven for recurring themes and highlights.
Okay, well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raven Clark. And I am the Satellite Program Coordinator at the Jefferson. And I just wanted to start off by saying that I feel very privileged to have met everyone in the cohort and worked with everyone who, just a bunch of very intelligent and hardworking people. I started here at the Jefferson summer of 2021, and I got the chance to see what the 2021 cohort did. And I always wanted to be part of that. So I got what I wanted, and I am very pleased with the outcome. So today I'm going to talk about recurring themes and highlights with our project. We worked on this project for months on end, and we pivoted a lot. When we first learned of our prompt, we were kind of just like, where do we go from here? So we had a couple preliminary questions that we wanted to answer to guide our research methodology. So starting off with, is there even a divide? So the prompt had a presumption of an inherent divide between urban and rural Erie County. And because our topic was specifically about infrastructure, resources, and services, We had a very kind of like narrow scope with that because we could only focus on those specific concepts. Next, we wanted to know how we would be able to measure such a divide, what tools were available to us. Infrastructure, resources, and services are very concrete subjects to research. At first, we wanted to conduct interviews of residents in the various communities just to bolster the hard numbers that we collected for data, but for the sake of time, we were unable to do that. We found various scholarly sources on the relationship between urban and rural communities in different parts of the United States and a divide between the two, but none for Erie County specifically. We were able to utilize various resources for data on Erie County, but we were tasked with putting that data into context for our project. And then our final preliminary question was, is this divide inherently negative and does it need to be bridged? Are people generally choosing to live where they live based on their lifestyle preferences? For example, urban or metropolitan areas are usually characterized by large, dense, and more diverse populations with more cultural and commercial amenities and job opportunities than rural areas, versus rural areas are more sparsely populated with more land and more privacy and more natural amenities such as forests, creeks, etc. We heard from a few speakers at our municipal visits that kind of alluded to people in that community generally choosing to live where they live because of the various benefits. So, for example, people choosing to live in bedroom communities of Erie, so like, kind of aside from the hustle and bustle of the city, such as Harbor Creek or Mill Creek, because they have plenty of amenities, they're comfortable and relatively safe, but residents can also make that short commute into the city of Erie where they can find even more amenities and job opportunities as well. It is the best of both worlds situations, and many Erie County residents would consider these communities to be the suburbs of Erie, but for the sake of this study, we considered them to be urbanized with some rural aspects to them. So we spent a lot of time thinking about the different limitations to this project, pretty significant amount of time, especially at the beginning when we were deciding how we wanted to go about our research. One big limitation was the narrow scope of research. County-wide research on municipal infrastructure, resources, and services is pretty inconsistent. We broke up into groups where we took on the 9 different municipalities, and we all researched to see what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it. Statistics. That's the word I was looking for. And if they had municipal comprehensive plans and whatnot, just what was going on in these different municipalities. So some municipalities had a lot of information that was available, and others had kind of sparse information, spotty, or was outdated. Because of time constraints on our project, we were unable to conduct interviews or surveys of residents, which is what we initially wanted to do, just to get to contextualize the data that we were finding through our research of the different municipalities. There are 38 municipalities in Erie County, and the cohort was only able to observe and research 9 of them. And again, that was time constraints. We only had a few months to to finish this, so that was a big limitation for this study. And then we spent a lot of time trying to define the terms. So in our research of the scholarly research that we did initially, we saw a lot of different terms for different communities. So we saw like urban, metropolitan, micropolitan, urban clusters, suburban, rural, and rural adjacent. So we wanted to hone in on those and find very specific definitions for the sake of the study. And so we ended up using U.S. Census Bureau definitions of urban and rural to define each municipality, but I think they changed right when we were in the middle of working on this project. So that was cool. There was also a lot of overlap between infrastructure, resources, and services, and we had to determine what we meant by each, and so we decided to have modified Merriam-Webster definitions of those. And Olivia explained the definitions that we had, so I don't need to repeat those. But the definition, defining terms was a limitation for us. And so through our research, the cohort believes that the urban-rural divide is an oversimplification based on geography. It doesn't take into account several factors other than infrastructure, resources, and services. Like I said, that was our main focus of the project. However, this is a huge topic, and this is just a starting point for us. We observed apparent divides of opportunity across socioeconomic class, status, and education. Urban areas and rural areas have a lot in common when it comes to things like poverty. Poverty is everywhere in Erie County. And when we say we found a divide across access, what we mean by that is if you were living in poverty in Erie County, regardless of where you live, you will have less access to infrastructure, resources, and services. The one obvious divide between urban and rural would be transportation, as there is more public transit in cities than in rural areas. That's everywhere. But a divide that we observed was also the above I-90 and below effect, where suburban and shoreline urbanized rural areas had more favorable statistics, whereas southerly rural areas below Interstate 90 and the urban city of Erie were less off. So let me see if I can find the pointer. Yes. Okay, so this map kind of shows that, and I think it was Donnie who said, like, oh, those are kind of JES colors, so it's perfect. So as you can see, map of Erie County with the different municipalities, the city of Erie right there, and then there's I-90 right there. So what we observed was that basically these municipalities south of I-90, all very rural, and they had lower access to infrastructure, resources, and services. And then same with the city of Erie. And then we also observed that what we would consider suburban, but not for this specific paper, but like Harbor Creek or Fairview, Mill Creek, all of the municipalities that are urbanized along the shoreline they fared a lot better in our assessments. Okay, so context matters. Numbers are great, but what do they really mean? So we focus specifically on infrastructure, resources, and services, which is that's a lot of numbers right there. But like I said before, we really wanted to conduct surveys and interviews with residents of each community to put those into context. And then we also talked about different divides between urban and rural that we've observed personally. So things like race and ethnicity. So Erie County's population is about 18% people of color, while the city of Erie, which is the municipality that has the highest percentage of people of color, is about 34%. And we see this everywhere in the country. More urbanized areas generally have more diverse racially and ethnically versus rural areas that tend to be more homogenous. We also talked about culture. There's definite urban culture and rural culture. A lot of it's based on the amenities and lifestyle, just like what you have around you. So urban culture, I would say, would be characterized by nightlife and sports games, restaurants, shopping, arts and culture, etc. And rural culture would be more characterized by things like agriculture, county fairs, hunting and fishing, camping, etc. Politics. So Erie County is what is called a bellwether county and a swing state. And so all eyes are always looking at Erie County when we have major elections. And as we know in the United States, urban areas tend to vote blue and rural areas tend to vote red. So that would be another divide that we would like to look at for context. Also, policymaking priorities and representation. This goes a lot with politics, but I think it would be interesting to compare democratic representation and policymaking between urban and rural communities in Erie County, just to see trends of priorities. And finally, internal and external perceptions. So this would be a matter of interviewing residents and finding out how they view themselves, so like how urbanites view themselves and how they view residents of rural Erie County and vice versa. Okay, so another thing that we touched on was that there are no instruments have yet assessed any divides, public perceptions, connectivity, and interdependence and impact of any such urban-rural divide in Erie County. And we'd like to see a more comprehensive study done in the future. And finally, collaboration is key. We kind of touched on this before, but we've observed through scholarly literature how urban communities and rural communities adjacent to them can have mutually beneficial relationships when they work together to achieve common goals. We've observed adjacent municipalities in Erie County work together to achieve common goals, and this ideally would extend past the public sector and into collaboration between public and private as well. So collaboration, working together, communities working together to achieve common goals and make life better for all of their residents. Okay, so with that, I will introduce Autumn, who will give us some next steps.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Raven said, my name is Autumn Parker. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni and Employee Engagement at Allegheny College in Meadville, PA. Go Gators. Also, hi, Dad. How are you? Great to see you. Nevertheless, right, as we wrap up this presentation, before we transition into our Q&A, our cohort really wanted to emphasize the importance of humanizing this high-level content. And quite frankly, I want to appreciate you all for not snoring or falling asleep or crossing your eyes, because that can definitely happen when we are, really going into the depths of, again, high-level and sometimes dry stuff. And that's kudos to the presenters before me. So Olivia, Jenny, Clark, Donnie, I almost forgot your name. I know, we went to high school together, sorry. And Raven, who have eagerly and excitedly approached this information. So I thank you all for setting that foundation and giving people more of that scholastic, macro level information. That being said, again, we really want to humanize this work because it's important that we not only make it accessible, right, from a public engagement and conversation standpoint, but most importantly, applicable, right? How do we leave here? How do we enact this in our everyday lives? So I'm going to walk us through what may be perhaps a non-traditional interactive activity. And I'm going to invite you all to look to your right, to the person next to you. If you find that it's a wall, please don't talk to it. And if your spirit allows you to say this, tell that person, you belong here. 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 I see some of you didn't have anyone to talk to, so look behind you, look in front of you. Tell that person, you belong here. All right, so come back to me. I love seeing the smiles. But as we come back together, right, let's take a quick minute to marinate on what we just spoke to another living, breathing human being. How many of you, when you were saying those words, thought that person looks like they came from Albion, Union City, Erie City, all the 9 counties that we talked about, or municipalities, excuse me? I saw a lot of head shakes, no. You probably didn't even think about how they got here, where they were coming from. More than likely, you're like, I'm super nervous and anxious. I don't know why I'm doing this. But also, perhaps, too, you felt just a sensation of community belonging, that someone took the time to acknowledge you, to see you, to value you for being in this shared space. And that's really what this work is about, right? When we're talking about making it applicable. Yes, it is important that at local, state, and federal levels, we are enacting policies, right, that reflect the solutions in place to address these inequities, again, that my presenters walked us through across resources, infrastructure, and services throughout our county. But it also starts in small ripples of how you simply expose and engage with your fellow human being, right? And so, thinking about that, we wanted to emphasize, too, in this humanization, the importance of the fact that the rural and urban divide stems from literature addressing particularly economic disparities and inequities. Do I have any economists in the room? Thank God, okay, so you can't tell me if I'm wrong or right. No, but seriously, right, Thomas Sowell, he's a Black economist, and he said the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to fully satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is disregard the first lesson of economics. So I'm not going to discuss politics and frame it in this dichotomy notion, right, of two-party systems, right? Rather, I'm just going to define it as the activities associated with the governance of a county, a country, or any other area that we want to describe, right? And so as we're thinking about the activities that are taking place throughout our county governments, many of them have been operating in silos that exacerbate this narrative that we are existing in a scarcity mindset, that we have to compete for these resources, services, and infrastructure. But also to offset that, many of my presenters walk through initiatives and programs in place that are challenging that and operating in an intergovernmental network. So calling upon civic change agents, local legislators, higher ed entities, and other stakeholders in this game to say, hey, we have the same common shared purpose. That's CREMA, United, Way, also Infinite Erie, through the investment playbook. They're realizing, because of this shared mission, why should we operate in a silo? Why not just centralize our resources? Have a mass bucket that we can allocate across demographics and their needs. And so to that point, quite frankly, this is going to be redundant, but also we're not trying to reinvent the cycle, because we have to we have to utilize what's working and then make it sustainable. And so if there are any of you right now who are currently looking for process partners to address some of these inequities we walk through, whether it was the resources such as in services and infrastructure, education, energy, utilities, transportation, broadband, etc., we invite you to follow up with already entities in play that are looking for process partners like you to further said initiatives. Part of this work means getting outside of our household, outside of our comfort zones, residencies, and telling someone, you belong here and I want to make you feel that way. So we are now going to transition into Q&A. I thank you all for giving us your attention, and we look forward to answering any questions and thoughts that you want to flesh out with us. And that's a wrap. We did it.